Hello YouTube, my name is Swalesy, and in this video I'm going to be testing and comparing damage and DPS values for a number of different weapons in the game, of which are coming onto the screen now. The motivation for this was due to the recent changes that Bungie implemented at the start of Season 10, and as it turns out, I actually enjoyed making my first YouTube video, which was reviewing the nerfs to the last word. So the weapon changes in question mainly affect sniper rifles, Izanagi's burden in particular, and all grenade launchers, with a further adjustment to 150 RPM archetypes. They're now being shown on screen, with the main point of interest being a 20% reduction to sniper rifle damage, so pre-Shadowkeep values. Izanagi's burden's honed edge animation is no longer affected by the reload stat, that's not on screen by the way, and aggressive frame grenade launchers, now known as rapid fire grenade launchers, which are 150 RPM weapons such as Swarm with a Raven, have had their damage output reduced, and on top of that, all archetypes of heavy weapon grenade launchers have received a damage reduction of 10% against major enemies and above. All testing was done on Greg the Ogre in the Cargo Bay 3 Lost Sector on Titan, coupled with some fire rate and reload testing in the Tribute Hall. I didn't do damage against the Ogre in the Tribute Hall, as the light level of weapons influences damage all the way up to the level cap, or at least as far as I can tell. My Izanagi's burden was at something like 960 light, and then infused it up to around 970, 980, and it did more damage. So the only way to make the test fair and consistent across all weapons would have been to have them at the exact same light level, and that wasn't going to happen. I believe raid bosses may have different damage values to other major enemies and bosses, but the DPS of each weapon should scale equally. The video will consist of various clips with snippets of testing and numbers/calculations for the weapon currently being shown. Then at the end of the video I'll put all data into a table format and display that on the screen, so you can then digest as much or as little as you want at your own pace. But if you just want to jump straight to that, there is a timestamp in the description down below. Now, before we begin, for those eagle-eyed viewers out there, you may notice during the video that some values don't seem right. Rates of fire values, time to empty a magazine, reload times, etc. So, during the testing, I did come across a few, shall we say, inconsistencies in the stats for certain weapons, specifically fire rates. Anything you see that doesn't appear correct, I will explain it all at the end of the video when the full table is on screen, and hopefully it's not just because my maths is wrong or I've made a huge mistake. Just a reminder, if you want to skip straight to that, there is a timestamp in the description down below. I'd just like to add that there was no exotic armour or mods used that could improve weapon DPS, so there was nothing to reduce reload times, there was nothing to increase overall damage, etc. These are raw values. So finally, onto some damage testing, starting with Whisper of the Worm, unfortunately though without the catalyst. I'm not going to read all the numbers off the screen, but ultimately Whisper is capable of 26,562 DPS. Which is actually really good. The problem though is that it's only achievable by landing every precision shot without missing. You'll also need to do that at maximum fire rate, so no delays allowed to say adjust the scope and your aim. Very high DPS, easy to fall short. I know some of you are looking at that fire rate and thinking it should be 72 RPM, but like I've said, I am going to explain anomalies like this at the end of the video. So moving on now to Izanagi's burden without the catalyst to start, capable of a maximum DPS of 16,353 with a 4 times honed edge buff. Reload was measured to be 3.5 seconds. Not bad, but not great. Now, Izanagi's burden with the catalyst is capable of a maximum DPS of 19,623. Of course, that's with a 4 times honed edge buff. I don't personally have the catalyst, but I believe it's a flat 20% increase, although I could be wrong, so this value is simulated. It's also only achievable if firing immediately after reload, so even aiming down sights will reduce DPS. Moving on to D.A.R.C.I, the first weapon so far with more than one round in the magazine and the need to reload. In this scenario and for every other weapon like this, I've taken the total damage per magazine, so 107,352 in this example, and divided that number by the time to empty the magazine plus the time to reload. D.A.R.C.I numbers on screen are with the target acquired perk proc, which is also taken into consideration in the reload time, around half a second, as you need to aim down sights again and activate the perk. This brings the maximum potential DPS to 17,774, but D.A.R.C.I fires very fast and, as you already know, requires every shot to be a crit, leaving little room for error. So, Anarchy, personal favourite of mine. I absolutely adore this weapon. So, for those that don't know, Anarchy's purpose is damage over time, but despite that, impact damage in this example has been taken into consideration for total DPS. Damage over time is for 2 mines fired, any more gives no advantage other than a very small amount of impact damage. Now, 1 mine does naturally produce half the DPS, so more numbers are in the table at the end of the video. So with what's on the screen, and based on a damage over time duration of 10 seconds, DPS is 14,375. Now, that's not great, but you can fire those 2 mines and then switch to another weapon, say Mountaintop for example, or even Revoker, and increase that DPS value considerably. Moving on now to Wendigo with explosive light times 6. Without dwelling too much on the numbers, it's capable of a DPS value of 25,657, which is good, like really good. As with D.A.R.C.I, that's derived by taking the total damage per magazine, so 164,976, and dividing it by the times to empty the magazine plus the reload time. Values for DPS without explosive light are included in the table at the end of the video, which is where Wendigo stumbles slightly, as DPS drops to 15,057. Now, of course, if you combine the DPS of a magazine with explosive light and a magazine without, it's not too bad at all at 20,057. Although on paper that does drop the longer you fire, but seriously, how long are you going to fire Wendigo for? Overall, that's very good DPS. So now we're moving on to another favourite of mine, Swarm of the Raven with spike grenades. The maths is quite straightforward, and on the screen now with a DPS of 17,842. That's derived by the total damage per magazine, so 88,675, divided by the time to empty the magazine plus reload time. Now, as I've said previously, if any numbers look wrong, I will be explaining how I determine them at the end of the video, and there is a timestamp for that in the description below if you want to skip straight to it. Next is Interference 6, a 120 RPM grenade launcher, as opposed to Swarm of the Raven previously, which was 150 RPM, and this also has spike grenades. Now, as before, the maths is simple. The weapon is capable of a total DPS of 16,758. That's derived by total damage per magazine, so 99,210, divided by time to empty the magazine plus reload time. There was a very small amount of variation in impact damage for this weapon, so I've taken an average. So moving on now and testing Xenophage, a 120 RPM machine gun. Now this weapon does 15,322 damage per round, but has no crit damage, so you can shoot an enemy in the little toe and it will achieve these numbers. It has 13 rounds in the magazine, so total damage is 199,186. Divide that value by the time to empty the magazine plus reload time, and overall DPS is 16,766, which is reasonable. Now, the thing with Xenophage though is it can fire for over 6 seconds without requiring you to reload, which is a significantly long time when you compare it to some other weapons. So sustained DPS is somewhat relevant with this weapon, and it comes in at 30,644, which is very good. And as you could just see in the clip, I was able to kill Greg the Ogre really fast. Next up is Sleeper Simulant, a classic DPS weapon in the Destiny franchise and is capable of 42,513 per crit shot. So with 3 in the magazine, total damage is 127,539 and is achieved really quickly as it only requires 3 rounds. Just don't do what I just did and miss your crit shots. Overall DPS, so taking into consideration reload time, is 18,298. As I've said a number of times in the video now, if any values look a bit off, I do explain how I got to these at the end of the video. Swiftly moving on and taking a look at Leviathan's Breath, which is capable of 40,233 damage per crit shot. Without any mods or pieces of armour that increase heavy ammo reserves, it can hold a total of 10 rounds, so total damage is 402,330, the highest of all weapons in this test. I have actually timed the fire rate of this bow and it's around 24 RPM, which brings the overall DPS to 16,093. Now, reaction time plays a big part with bows, as you need to release the trigger the instant that it's fully drawn in order to achieve the best possible DPS, so the smallest of delays will reduce that value. So, truth. I wanted to throw a couple of rocket launchers into the mix and see how they now compare to sniper rifles and grenade launchers. But while using this weapon, I did notice that the in-game fire rate seemed wrong. So I did some testing of my own, and which I'll show later into the video, but found the fire rate to actually be more like 46 RPM, not the 15 that's listed in the game. Due to the grenade and horseshoes perk, which causes projectiles to detonate when in close proximity, I did struggle to get consistent damage readings regardless of whether I was aiming down sight and allowing it to lock on, or firing from the hip. So for the numbers on screen, I've included impact damage and used the maximum potential damage output. I've also included the minimum possible damage though in the table at the end. So Truth has the potential to do a maximum of 39,913 damage per round, so total damage per magazine is 119,742, and overall DPS comes in at 17,033, which isn't bad at all if you can actually achieve consistent impact damage. And finally, Bad Omens. Now this has the cluster bomb perk, so for that I've taken average damage as it does vary slightly. So with that in mind, each projectile was capable of 41,937 damage, which is actually very good, but because it only has 1 rocket in the magazine, overall DPS is totally ruined and it sits at a very uncompetitive 10,753, which is the lowest in the test. Now finally, the infamous table that I keep talking about. Firstly, I apologise for how cluttered it looks. I just wanted to be as transparent as possible when discussing values. I know it's a lot to take in and more than likely a little difficult to see individual numbers, especially on a small screen. So again, I am sorry, but I have made a really simplified version that I'm going to show in a minute, which is just weapon and the DPS. So quickly, weapons are top to bottom and arranged based on overall DPS, highest at the top moving to the lowest at the bottom. Then left to right we start with the weapon in question, then damage, then the number of rounds in the magazine unless you don't need to reload, therefore it's total reserves, total damage, time to empty the magazine if relevant, sustained DPS, so that's if you don't need to reload, but if you do it's then reload time, and finally overall DPS, that last column being the important one, which is why it's highlighted in green. Now, some explanation for the numbers. I measured reload time using the time encoder built into Adobe Premiere Pro, as I wanted to know exactly what that reload time was for each individual weapon, rather than taking an average over emptying 2, 3 or 4 magazines. So I measured from the frame that the last round was fired from a magazine, up to the frame before it was fired in the next magazine. Very accurate, but this did introduce a problem. So after you fire a round, there is a short delay before you can reload. This is the animation of the weapon settling from any recoil. It's only short, but that animation is taken into consideration when the fire rate of the weapon is set by Bungie and listed in the game. This meant that I couldn't calculate the time to empty the magazine by using the RPM value of the weapon, as it would also take into consideration the animation after the last round of the magazine has been fired twice, if that makes sense. So, when determining that time to empty a magazine, I measured from the frame that the first round was fired to the frame that the last round was fired. This explains why sometimes to empty the magazine, values appear less than they should be compared to calculating it theoretically. Now, in case that didn't make any sense whatsoever, the times may be lower, but you absolutely can fire all rounds in the times listed. Overall though, this is way overkill for Destiny, but extremely accurate, and that's how I like it. So I'm not going to talk too much about numbers on the screen, as you can see them for yourself, just about. And I will be displaying a simplified table after the next clip. Now, there still are a couple of weapons that I want to focus on, starting with Truth. Bungie lists this rocket launcher as being 15 RPM, but when using it, this did not feel right. I hope there isn't something obvious that I'm overlooking, but after some testing, I found it to actually be 46 RPM. So, a significant difference, and as you can imagine, it was critical that this value was correct when calculating any kind of sustained DPS. So coming onto the screen now is evidence of Truth firing at an RPM of 46. It is a minute long though, so just skip ahead if you don't want to sit through it. And there you have it, Truth firing 46 rounds in a minute. Don't know why it's listed in the game as 15 RPM, whether it's a mistake or intentional and I'm unaware of something, but because of this, Truth is actually capable of an overall DPS of 17,033 if you can achieve impact damage for every round, which is something I couldn't do due to the grenade and horseshoes perk. This makes it quite viable, but that drops significantly without impact damage at 13,251 DPS, which would make it the second lowest in the test. So the simplified table is now on screen, and the next fire rate anomaly was with Whisper of the Worm. Some of you may have seen earlier in the video that I had it down as 76 RPM, not the 72 RPM it says it is in the game, and that's because it fires 76 shots a minute. I decided to test its fire rate using the same method as Truth, although I haven't put that in the video, and it managed, like I say, 76 shots. This obviously affects overall DPS, and those extra 4 rounds per minute increase said DPS by almost 1,500, giving us the value shown on screen of 26,562. The catalyst for Whisper of the Worm gives it box breathing, so after a short time of aiming down sights, it will gain bonus damage, making it even more of a DPS monster. Now, Sleeper Simulant, which has a charge time of 1024 milliseconds without the catalyst, a nice round number for computer fans, but calculating fire rate based on this alone would make it around 58 to 59 RPM, and this weapon does not fire faster than Truth, which is 46. So, using the same testing method again, Sleeper was found to fire 38 rounds per minute. Another thing to note, when measuring time to empty the magazine, all charge times were included, obviously. Therefore, when measuring reload speed, I didn't take time from shot to shot like other weapons, but from the final shot in the magazine to the moment it started charging for the first round in the next magazine. And take a breath. A very capable weapon with an overall DPS of 18,298, but this is without the catalyst that unfortunately I don't have, so I can't test it. Moving on now to Leviathan's Breath, and when calculating fire rate for this weapon, I ignored the draw time and just used the same testing method as on previous weapons, and found its fire rate came to around 24 RPM with each shot being fully drawn. Of course, reaction time can play a part in this. Nothing special when it comes to DPS, which is 16,093, and probably more for ad clearing due to the Leviathan's side perk, which knocks enemies back when the bow has been fully drawn. Now, I just wanted to make a quick note on D.A.R.C.I. When using it for any kind of damage phase, you need to ensure the target acquired perk is procced, otherwise DPS can drop from 77,774, which is quite good, to 14,401, which isn't that good. These are, of course though, best and worst case scenarios. Another weapon I quickly want to touch on is Wendigo. This grenade launcher with explosive light is extremely good for DPS, sitting at 25,657, but that's only for one magazine, after which you'll likely be firing with no explosive light buff at all. So in the table I've taken the average DPS for 2 magazines fired from Wendigo, with 1 explosive light and 1 without. That comes in at a still very good DPS of 20,366. This obviously drops on average the more you fire the weapon, but Wendigo with no explosive light at all during a damage phase will average 15,057 DPS, so it's absolutely crucial that you have that buff. And the final weapon I want to talk about is Anarchy. As I said before previously in the video, I absolutely love this weapon. It sits at the bottom of the table looking rather ineffective, but that DPS value is based on damage over time across 10 seconds. The first number for 1 grenade fired, the second number for 2. Any more and you get no extra damage unless it's a really big target, such as Xol for example, where I believe you can fire 2 pairs of shots at opposite ends of the boss and get extra damage. Now, the best way to be effective with this gun is to switch to another weapon after firing 2 rounds and then do additional damage with that. I quickly calculated the DPS for Evoker and found it to be around 8,600, which isn't great, meaning coupling that with Anarchy though would produce something in the region of 22,975, which is actually very good. I imagine Mountaintop would be even better, but as with a lot of other things in this video, I don't have it, so I can't test it. And all this is teaching me now is that I need to play the game more and unlock all these weapons and catalysts that I don't have. So, that's everything that I wanted to talk about. It did drag on a bit and the main table is cluttered, but like I say, I wanted to be as transparent as possible and show everything on screen, as well as explain how I determined some numbers that initially would have looked wrong. Any thoughts? Whispers back, baby! Not that it really went anywhere, as it's always been viable. Wendigo surprised me, especially beating Izanagi's with the catalyst, which was also across 2 magazines. I'm now itching to jump into the game and get Sleeper Simulant's catalyst, and then do the same testing again, as well as with Whisper of the Worm's catalyst. Truth was a surprise as well, but that's a best case scenario with impact damage included from all rounds, which I couldn't achieve consistently. Overall, a little shock at the quoted RPM figures for some weapons compared to what I tested them as in-game, so I'm hoping it's not due to a mistake on my behalf or something obvious that I've overlooked. There are other weapons I would have liked to include, but either I just didn't think of them until after the video was pretty much finished, the Prospector grenade launcher for example, or, like so many other things, I just don't have them. 1000 Voices being a prime example of that. Bad Omens was included just to see what a rocket launcher with cluster bombs is capable of. Other rocket launcher archetypes might yield slightly better results. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for watching, especially if it's from the start and you made it this far. It's taken a lot of time to make the video as I was learning new editing software along the way, but in future that means these should be uploaded quicker. Any questions or feedback, please post them in the comments down below. Now, if anyone is interested in footage for the fire rate testing of weapons, such as Whisper of the Worm for example, or on my method for testing time to empty a magazine and reload times, please let me know, as I'd happily put a video together explaining that and upload it. Links to Twitter and Twitch in the description down below. Hoping to start streaming again soon, so maybe see you in the chat sometime. And also I hope you return to my YouTube channel for future videos if you enjoyed this one, and or my The Last Word review, which is linked down below. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. That's a wrap!